Gay rights as a movement is primarily concerned with tolerance for overt homosexuality, overt gay marriage, for example. But there's always been this interesting flip side having to do with tolerance for covert homosexuality. If you have the right to be homosexual, which in Canada and the United States now you do, if you have the right to be in a gay marriage, which in the United States and Canada now you do, what then is the status in our society of gay people who choose to identify as straight, who choose to lead a double life, if you want to say it that way, who choose to adopt a public identity or persona of pretending to be heterosexual when they are not? Do we tolerate that also? Or do we judge that more harshly than before precisely because we have normalized and embraced the tolerance of overt homosexuality? Does covert homosexuality start to be regarded as something immoral? Today is the day. Today is June 5th, 2020. Today is the day when allegations are sweeping across the internet that Lindsey Graham is a homosexual. Lindsey Graham is a conservative Republican politician, and the finger is being pointed at Lindsey Graham by a man who claims that he has had sexual relations with him himself, and that man has also stood up on the internet, figuratively speaking, and made a call for volunteers. He's asked other men who've had love affairs, who have slept with the senator, to also stand up and either provide some evidence or at least testify to the effect that, yes, indeed, Lindsey Graham is homosexual, that he has been living some kind of double life, that he has been living a lie. I'm reminded of a kind of often told anecdote in anthropology. I never read this thesis myself. I never read the study myself. But it is commonly said in anthropology classrooms in universities around the world, there was an anthropologist who wrote about culture and society of Ireland, modern Ireland, contemporary Ireland, who observed basically that in Ireland, many homosexuals were living incredibly miserable lives because they chose to have a Christian identity rather than a gay identity. They chose, for the sake of their family, out of some strange sense of pride, out of a sense of not wanting to let down maybe their parents and cousins and what have you, and even maybe out of a sense of national identity. But they chose to live the lie of pretending to be straight and continuing to participate in the church, because a lot of them cared a lot about this religious identity. And really, this anthropologist was describing they were closing the door on any possibility of their own personal happiness. They were ruining their own public lives, ruining their private lives for the sake of their public lives, I should say, something along those lines. So that's a thesis probably nobody in this audience would be surprised to hear. Yup, there are gay people who are so inculcated with religion that they choose to pretend that they're straight, and as a result, they're miserable. End of story. Not the end of the story. What's really interesting about this anecdote is there was sort of a letter writing campaign, and to my knowledge, some of these letters were published in the newspapers in Ireland from homosexuals in Ireland, some of whom participated in this study. Some of whom were people who had been interviewed by this anthropologist or were, observed and discussed in this book by this anthropologist, and they stepped forward and said, "Not so fast. What you're saying here is really shallow and really judgmental and really wrong." And some of these homosexuals, again, it might have been 2 or 3 people, I don't know, I'm not saying it's a huge number, but some of them stepped forward and said, "Hey, there's more to life than sex and sexuality. Who are you to say that I'm miserable if this is how I choose to live my life?" Maybe they're perfectly happy that way. Maybe they value other things in their life, whether you think of those as spiritual or otherwise. They stepped forward and said, "Hey, wait, we have the right to live our lives on our term." They could say, to rephrase wildly, they could say, look, if you say you tolerate homosexuality, then you also have to tolerate or respect homosexuals who choose to live in the way that they did, which, again, to my knowledge, involved celibacy, if not outright self-hatred. When I was a much, much younger man, I would have agreed with the thesis that tolerating gay people includes also tolerating gay people who wish to appear publicly as straight. Gay people who would prefer to wear the mask, or, for example, a gay man who would prefer to have some kind of arrangement with a straight woman where they get married, even though they're aware that this guy is gay, that also has to be embraced, that also has to be tolerated. I would have argued, this is when I was a much younger man, that, people like Lindsey Graham, their sexuality is valid too, their sense of identity is valid too, and even if it seems kind of perverse and weird for people to publicly maintain the facade of being heterosexual while privately they're homosexual, that certainly has a tradition of many centuries, and that even though we're taking away the persecution of homosexuals, which of course goes back to the Dark Ages or goes back to antiquity to some extent, even though we're now taking away that persecution and we're now going to embrace and tolerate the gay identity as normal, that doesn't mean that we should therefore force an overt gay identity on those who would prefer to remain covert. That's cool too. I have lost this enlightened perspective just with the kind of peculiar experience that accumulates as you get older in life. You get to know couples where a straight woman married a gay man, and in a really subtle and perverse way, living with the lie ruined everyone's life in that family. Even though, from my perspective, being gay is not something to lie about. It's not something to conceal. It's not something you should have this kind of guilt about. But people do. And people involve a whole broader family unit. They involve all these other people in lying about it. And I think it's actually profoundly destructive. It doesn't just result in the gay person himself living a worse life. It can be devastating for a large number of other lives connected to him. I remember an interview with a female basketball player. So she was a white woman. I remember her being more than 6 feet tall, but I forget. And she had been a career female basketball player, and she had married a male basketball player. And that basketball player at that time, this is now over 7 years ago, he stepped forward and more or less claimed the title of the first openly gay player in basketball. Now, whether or not he was really the first openly gay player in American Major League Basketball, I think that can be contested. Does it go to Dennis Rodman? There are some questions here. Does Dennis Rodman count only as bisexual or something? Anyway, but at any rate, he was one of the first men in the NBA to step forward and say that he was gay, and he'd been gay all his life. But the woman being interviewed had been his wife. And she had the honesty to come forward and say, hey, look, I know everyone's patting this guy on the back and is happy for him because now he's coming out of the closet. Now he's declaring that openly he's gay. But here are the impacts on my life. And for her, it really meant that she lost her opportunity to have children, and that for, I think, decades, I'm sorry, I forget how long their marriage lasted, but for her personal life, her family life, her whole world revolved around what was ultimately living a lie, what was ultimately helping this guy with, unbeknownst to her, what was helping this guy project an image of macho-ness and heterosexuality that obviously he felt at the time was crucial to his career as a basketball player or what have you. Or maybe he also had religious reasons. He wanted to seem that he was married and straight when he went to church or in front of his parents, grandparents, cousins, what have you. I'm sure there were various elements of ego. But really, when that marriage came to an end and she was getting a divorce and then her husband is finally admitting to himself in the world that he's gay, this has had unbelievably negative consequences for her. And, the negative consequence for the person who chooses to live a lie, it may be harder to trace. But again, I'm now in my 40s. I've known enough people up close and personal who lived a lie in terms of their sexuality, maybe most often of all, and the corrosive effect on your character, the corrosive effect on all elements of your life. It's difficult to exaggerate. It's really difficult to communicate to someone who's younger and hasn't had that kind of experience just how corrosive and negative the influence is of someone living in a lie, maybe in connection to their sexuality most of all, right? But we're still at a turning point in the culture, right? I think nobody is yet wanting to commit to saying that somebody like Lindsey Graham has an absolute moral obligation to live their life honestly and openly as a homosexual at all times. Nobody's willing to say that you have an obligation as a civil servant or as a politician to make your private life public in that way. Nobody's willing to say that, your politics has to be consistent with your private personal sexual life. And nobody said that to Bill Clinton back when Bill Clinton was getting into trouble for his sex life. And nobody has quite yet said it to Lindsey Graham. So the campaign now of a group of male sex workers to expose Lindsey Graham, I think, is not so much momentous, historical, or meaningful just in exposing the possibility that Lindsey Graham is a homosexual, allegedly. I think it's really important in leading us to ask the question, as we more and more accept homosexuality as somebody's primary public identity, as we accept gay marriage, as we accept, the life in society publicly. We just had someone running for president of the United States for the Democrat Party who's openly homosexual and openly in a gay marriage, as I recall. We now do have openly gay politicians along with openly gay athletes and all manner of celebrities and what have you. But at what point does that openness not merely become an option, but become an obligation? At what point is it that we turn to people like Lindsey Graham and say, no, 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 no. You don't get to choose to be a fake heterosexual. You actually do have a kind of moral obligation. Maybe it's to society, maybe it's an obligation to yourself to be authentic and open about this particular thing. I think that's a necessary implication of the triumph of the gay rights movement over the last several decades, but it's an implication that, broadly speaking, in our society, none of us are quite comfortable with yet. Because if you as a politician have to say to the public that you're gay, well, for one thing, that may impact your ability to be elected, in Lindsey Graham's case. But of course, the other thing we all know is, if Lindsey Graham has to say that to the people who vote for him, it means he has to say that to his grandmother, to his mother, to his cousin, his aunts and uncles. And people don't want to impose on Lindsey Graham in particular, or on gay people who choose to live in the closet in general. They don't want to impose that disruption to the family, to the personal life, private life. But on the other hand, we know when you scale it up, when you talk about a society of millions, exactly what you're trying to positively motivate people to do is say, hey, stand up. Tell your parents. Tell your grandparents. If you're a politician, tell your constituents. Not all gay people are left-wing. Some are right-wing, Not all gay people are atheists. Some are Christians. But if you don't stand up, if you can't stand up and do this for yourself, maybe we have to ask you to stand up and do this, appealing to your sense of magnanimity, asking you, what kind of society in the future do you want to be a part of? Because it's best for all of us as a society if you can stand up, if you can challenge the bigotry and ignorance of your own family. Because even if they react really negatively in that moment, they're going to come away with it, with that memory. Oh yeah, Uncle Lindsey, homosexuals, they aren't something far off. They aren't somebody you've never met. There are homosexual members of your own family, even if you don't know it yet. You have homosexual coworkers, even if you don't know it yet. By making it known, that ultimately is the necessary path to having a truly inclusive and truly tolerant society. I don't think we can have tolerance based on secrecy. And the knock-on effects of living a lie for the person living in the closet himself, for the members of their family, it's really just difficult to convey how corrosive that can be.